Climate governance is a very new, emerging and ever-changing field. It draws both on the best of the climate change technical literature as well as core governance ideas. It looks at how governance thinking around, for example, managing public resources, building political commitment, the analytical tools of political economy, and how public participation can be integrated into thinking about the implementation of international climate commitments and climate action. So that's the area that we're concerned with here. Climate action is, of course, a deeply complex area of work. It's contested, it operates at many different levels, it involves a multiplicity of actors across government, the private sector, think tanks like ours, and organised NGOs. The literature itself is still very new. It's emerging. It's only literally the last few years that we're building up a body of insight, both empirically and theoretically, about this set of issues. And one way of going about understanding what comes out of the literature is to divide it up into the following categories. One is on politics and political commitment around climate action. A second one is about the institutions that provide the context and the wider supporting environment for climate action. And a third concerns more how the wider public, the organised civil society, and coalitions are built up around supporting climate action by governments. So I'll briefly go through each of those and give some illustrations about how those questions are addressed in the literature. On the first, regarding politics and political commitment, we saw with the Paris Agreement signed last December how over 180 heads of state around the world committed themselves at the national level to vigorous action on climate through both mitigation and adaptation. After Paris, we're now in the stage of how are those commitments actually going to be implemented in reality. So much of the interest of the literature addresses that question. So in terms of the political dimensions of the question, some of the literature looks at how do you build long-term political commitment? How do you sustain that commitment over time? Particularly when climate action has to be thought about in terms of decades rather than years. Political cycles, of course, or electoral cycles, are years rather than decades. So how do you fortify that commitment through heads of state? How do you build effective coalitions within governments and outside governments? So some of the studies, notably those contained in the collection by Schmitz, look at 4 countries, Brazil, South Africa, China and India. And they try and explore how do coalitions of support build up around incremental climate commitments in those 4 countries. Inevitably, what happens is that the politics is not one-sided. It's not just how coalitions between, for example, renewable energy producers, forward-thinking government officials, technical experts in civil society and universities come together to support climate change commitments, but it's also the politics of those who might oppose effective far-reaching policy on climate change. And of course there's many vested interests and lobbies who oppose effective climate action, not least within the fossil fuel and energy lobbies. So one strand of the literature is really trying to help us understand in countries how coalitions can be built up to support those in charge of long-term policy making and underpin political commitment. The tools of political economy analysis, which a couple of the readings in the pack illustrate, including the one I've just mentioned, help us understand the complexity of the proponents and opponents of climate action in different countries. Finally, on the politics, the question is around how is the agenda set for supporting effective climate action. Sometimes it's not necessarily around climate policies per se, but it's around other things that drive political commitment. The benefit of large-scale investment in a renewables energy in a particular country can be one of those, and the benefits that generates in terms of employment. So the lens we adopt here is very much the national level political commitments as opposed to global level commitments. The second area of interest lies in institutions. How do you build effective institutions to support effective action on climate change over the longer term? And those institutions include, for example, the legal framework. What are the laws that support and commit governments to effective cumulative action over time? How do those laws ensure a certain degree of stickiness so that commitments cannot easily be reversed? So some of the reading in the pack considers that broader legal institutional environment governing climate action. Another aspect of institutions concerns transparency. And this is still very new and evolving, and as yet it's a gap in the literature. Not that much addresses the opportunities for laws on opening up government information and making processes concerning the elaboration of climate commitments transparent. It's touched on here and there in some of the readings, but it's certainly one area where we expect to see an emergent literature come through. One additional point concerning the institutions that support climate action are the way in which government works and the capacity it has to effectively implement climate commitments. This is critical since most of the planning and implementation undertaken to support national action on climate change takes place through government sources, through government channels. Not all governments have the capacity to plan effectively in terms of climate action. Very often you find different parts of government may ultimately have responsibility for investments that support climate adaptation, but they're not well coordinated. So quite a lot of attention will need to be given and is addressed in some of the literature about planning and about the capacity of government to effectively implement commitments around climate change and what sort of capacity building is required to support that work. One final additional point for consideration is a very important actor outside government, namely the private sector. The private sector, of course, has strong interests in both resisting and potentially supporting climate change around both the fossil fuel lobbies, who generally would be slower to offer support and sometimes resist efforts to move in that direction. But there are new opportunities which can be harnessed by the part of the private sector that sees opportunities to invest more in solar and in other forms of renewables to diversify the energy mix and rely less on fossil fuels. So ensuring that the private sector is a critical actor and a potential ally in coalitions to support effective climate policy cannot go ignored, and indeed is addressed in a number of the readings covered by the pack. The third area of interest is summarised under the label of civil society and participation. In the run-up to the highly successful Paris Agreement last year, in the end of 2015, we saw huge civil society mobilisation in many countries around the world, getting their governments to commit to far-reaching climate action, which they successfully did. Many of those were represented in large number at the Paris talks in November, December. However, even though that involved many committed climate activists, it still represents a relatively modest sliver of organised civil society. So some of the literature is exploring the content and nature of civil society movements which seek to both hold governments accountable for their commitments and broad-base awareness of the need to hold governments true to their climate commitments to the wider public by promoting greater awareness and education around climate issues. So the question there is about how can one use tools to broaden civil society engagement more broadly. and a recent publication covered in the reading guide does look at the way in which civil society, as a diverse set of non-governmental actors, not just climate experts, can provide further momentum and hold government to account for their own commitments. The final point I'd like to highlight is another governance area, which is around the effective use of public resources to support climate action, in particular through the budget. And there is an emergent literature included in the reading pack around fiscal commitments, the budget process, and tracking financial resources for climate change. We expect to see very large amounts of resources coming into many countries, many developing countries, to support climate action. That was part of the Paris Agreement, particularly for adaptation investments on the ground. If the budget process is not transparent or effective, there's a real risk that some of those resources may not be used for their intended purposes. So work undertaken through the Adaptation Finance Accountability Initiative by ODI and WRI, which is included in the reading pack, seeks to do some of that, asking the question of how do resources intended for climate action get transferred into national budgets, how in turn are decisions taken about the use of those resources, and then subsequently how do they translate into investments at the local level on the ground to protect the poorest and most vulnerable from the worst effects of climate change.